List of 2,807 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee and require the length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report them?
So moved.
Second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. And I don't have a pen, so I have to sign this. Somebody. Thank you.
You have to sign this. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
All done.
Before the opening statement, let me just observe something here, and this comes from the heart. I've been around here a long time. I've served in the House for 8 years. I started in the Senate and was on the Senate Armed Services Committee starting in 1994. And I don't think I've ever seen a more impressive group of witnesses on a specific subject who are the better qualified than this in all that time. And I really mean it. I mean, we talk about Mr. Deasy, who's the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. He was also the CIO of J.P. Morgan Chase, British Petroleum Company, and General Motors. I mean, you know, we've not had one like that before. And Dr. Griffin, he knows this issue as well as anyone, anywhere. He's been our NASA administrator. And then we have Admiral Thad Allen. He has been the chairman of NASA's Space-Based Positioning, Navigation, and Time National Advisory Board. That's GPS, and so he's the authority on that. And then, of course, obviously, the chief of our space operations, General J. Raymond. So it's just a privilege to have you guys here, have this much quality here, this much authority. Because what we're going to be talking about is an issue that could be really damaging to our country if something is wrong. So I would say good morning to the committee and say good afternoon, and appreciate your being here. Now, because of the unusual circumstances, there's a new little required thing that we have to go through. So bear with me. Before we begin, I want to thank all of you for being here. It's required that we are abiding by guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician, Sergeant of Arms, Rules Committee, as we hold this hearing today. Many steps were taken to minimize the risk of our members, our witnesses, our staff, and the public. That means we're all 6 feet from one another. You've also got cleaning supplies at your seats, and if maintaining 6 feet of the separation becomes a problem, then I encourage you to use your mask. And that we're here today under these circumstances underscores the importance of the subject that we're addressing today. And what we're going to do, we're going to have our opening statements and then proceed on with 5-minute questions, and we're going to have a second round of questions too. This is a complex issue, but it ultimately boils down to risk, and I don't think it's a good idea to place at risk the GPS signals that enable our national and economic security for the benefit of one company and its investors. After extensive testing and analysis, experts at almost every federal agency tell us that Ligado's plan will interfere with our GPS systems. This will certainly affect our warfighters who rely on GPS for navigation, logistics, and precision guidance munitions, whether in training or on the battlefield. But this is about much more than risking our military readiness and capabilities. Interfering with GPS will hurt the entire American economy. We'll have some good witnesses to talk about that and elaborate on that. Our farmers rely on GPS to harvest their crops. Our truckers and airlines rely on GPS to move supplies and people. Our banks rely on GPS timing function. Every American uses GPS every day. And at the end of the day, economic security is national security. Now, we all agree that we need to compete with China in the 5G development. No one is disputing that fact. We've been working on that for months with the Department of Defense and the telecom industry cooperating with each other and accomplishing that very thing. That's not the issue. Ligado's proposal is not tied to that work whatsoever. Now, we're talking about the G5, the competition with China. They've tried to conflate their proposal with other mid-band spectrum sharing discussions, but in reality, these two issues are completely separate from each other. In answering the argument that GPS would be disruptive, the FCC says Ligado will be forced to pay for any disruptions its service causes to GPS. Now, the reality is that the FCC order only requires Ligado to replace government-owned devices. That doesn't accomplish if it were doable. Ultimately, the burden of mitigating harm interference will be placed on the Department of Defense, and the American taxpayers would end up, as normally is the case, having to pay for it. A few powerful people made a hasty decision over the weekend, in the middle of the national crisis, against the judgment of every other agency involved, and without cluing the president in on any of this. And I've had conversations with him, and I can assure you that's the case. The FCC may not be in this committee's jurisdiction, but the effects of its decision really are, and I think we all understand that. I hope our witnesses will speak to the enormous risk this decision has for everyone who relies on GPS in America. With the technical and important nature of this topic, we will structure this hearing with a consolidated opening statement from the three Department of Defense witnesses, followed by the fourth witness. This will allow a detailed explanation of the national security implications of the FCC's decision and what steps the military will need to take to mitigate these effects. The Department of Defense has provided materials to accompany their statement that are available in front of you and on display for the public view. Now, this is very significant because some people are familiar with this organization and some are not. But those who are know that this is where all of the defense people are. I plan to submit for the record a letter I received from the National Defense Industrial Association, which is made up of 1,700 businesses, 70,000 individual members, stating their strong opposition to Ligado's proposal, along with a list of 71 companies and associations that are opposed as well. The FCC was fully aware of this. They received the letter from this organization a week before their weekend vote. So you must believe that it couldn't get worse, but it is. Ligado took over a bankrupt company in 2015 and has been trying to obtain FCC licensing ever since. They waited until the whole world was distracted by COVID, the virus, and when everyone was looking the other way, and unannounced to the public, it wasn't announced, in total secrecy on a weekend, passed the most controversial licensing bill, I think, in the history of the FCC. And I say this because the federal agency opposition was unanimous. You never see that. We had all organizations, all federal agencies opposing this. Not just the military, but all of government and the private sector, including the airlines, the farmers, the truckers, the maritime manufacturers, opposed the licensing, and the FCC knew it. And hence, we had the weekend rushed vote. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the witnesses for appearing here today. This is a critical issue for the Defense Department and our nation, and it's important that we learn from these witnesses. We are holding this hearing in unusual circumstances. There has been a great deal of discussion about whether we should be here in person, with risk not only to senators but to all the support personnel who are needed to keep this institution running. In addition, the compelling point is made that if the Senate is in session, its predominant focus should be combating the pandemic. But this is a hearing I think that is essential. I want to commend Chairman Inhofe for establishing and holding a weekly call so that committee members can be briefed by Defense Department officials and ask questions regarding the coronavirus. The chairman ensured that we were able to conduct oversight even in difficult circumstances. But phone calls cannot replace a hearing, so when we plan future hearings, as consideration of the annual defense bill allows, I would certainly request that we consider these hearings in the context of both physical and virtual participation. And we also should focus on the effects of the pandemic on the Department of Defense and on threats that face the nation. Let me now turn to today's hearing about the decision by the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, to permit the company Ligado to operate a land-based network that, by its own admission, will interfere with DOD GPS systems, as well as those in other federal agencies and the civilian sector. Over 10 years ago, Ligado's predecessor, LightSquared, applied to the FCC to permit a satellite-based 4G system with a secondary land-based network in areas where satellite reception could not be obtained. The application was denied because of interference with the GPS system, and LightSquared was forced into bankruptcy. LightSquared and its Spectrum license was then brought in bankruptcy and reorganized as Ligado. In 2016, Ligado resubmitted an amended licensing application to the FCC to build a new ground tower-only transmission system. Ligado switched to a system of closely spaced, powerful ground tower signals threatens to interfere with GPS. Despite jeopardizing GPS and ignoring the scientific view of many federal agencies, the aviation industry, and GPS-dependent companies, the FCC granted the license without a public rulemaking to change from a satellite-based network to one that is totally land-based. I believe the FCC's decision to grant the license is problematic for several reasons. First, the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration is supposed to form a consensus among executive branch stakeholders like the Defense Department and FCC, an independent commission. In this case, the Department of Defense and other executive departments, like the Department of Transportation, objected to the application because of the interference with the GPS signal. Yet no consensus was reached before the license was granted. Second, the FCC license does not recognize the complicated nature of the Defense Department's weapon systems. Ligado maintains that DOD can simply replace affected GPS cards, but there are hundreds of thousands of GPS chips embedded in DOD weapon systems, and each chip is not only tuned to GPS, but embedded with interconnected electronics, each tuned to each other. Replacing a GPS card will also impact other features of a weapon system. How many weapon systems are affected, how they can be fixed, and the time and cost of the remedy is unknowable at this point, but the process will be lengthy and expensive. For a sense of what the FCC's decision could mean, we have a real-life example. In 1992, an FCC Spectrum repurposing decision eliminated the B2 radar band for DOD. Moving that radar to a new band took 30 years and $3 billion due to depot cycle rescheduling and operational demands. While the FCC order states that the onus is on Ligado to fix problems, in reality, the burden is actually on the Defense Department to find which weapon systems are affected, how severe the impacts are, and then negotiate with Ligado to get them fixed. Clearly, such a process will compromise military readiness. The Defense Department is working on a new set of hardened GPS chips called military-grade user equipment, or MGUE, which are jam-resistant to the power levels of the Ligado towers. However, these chipsets will not be installed in our weapon systems until the 2030s. The best course of action for national security would be to stay the license application and periodically review it until such time as the new chipsets can be installed in critical weapon systems. Finally, I've only discussed the problems the Defense Department is facing as a result of the FCC decision. I have not discussed the myriad of problems that will be faced by literally everyone who uses GPS. I do not believe that the FCC's decision to grant this license is in the best interest of our national security or our nation. I look forward to today's discussion about the issue. I again thank the witnesses and my colleagues for appearing at this hearing in these unusual and demanding times. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reed. We're going to have opening statements by our witnesses. Before we do, without objection, I'll ask unanimous consent that we enter into the record the National Defense Industry Association letter. I've already referred to that. The Industry Coalition letter with the 68 signatories that strongly oppose it. The Aerospace Industries Association letter on behalf of over 300 leading aerospace and defense manufacturers and suppliers who oppose the FCC's decision. The Airline Pilots Association International letter asking the Senate Armed Services Committee, this committee, to take action and stay this FCC ruling, and the Transportation Construction Coalition letter stating that they oppose Ligado's proposed network, and of course the letter from Ligado without objection to be made a part of the record. We'll start with our opening statements with you, Mr. Deasy. You've been a great contributor to everything that we do around here and that we stand for, and we appreciate your taking the time to be here and to really getting involved in this issue. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. Good afternoon. I'm Dana Deasy, the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. Sir, as you stated in your opening, with me today on behalf of the Department are Dr. Griffin, the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, and General J. Raymond, Chief of Space Operations, United States Space Force. In place of reading individual opening statements, we have prepared a short overview where Dr. Griffin will briefly explain the technical issues associated with FCC's ruling to allow Ligado to repurpose spectrum. Next, General Raymond will then explain the military mission impacts of that order on the department's operations. And I will briefly cover 5G and what actions the DOD is taking to leverage this important technology, as well as cover briefly how we are pursuing sharing mid-band spectrum. Finally, I have a chart where I'll summarize the key takeaways. With that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Griffin to begin.
Dr. Griffin.
Thank you. I'd like to take this chart in clockwise order and first key off of the point Senator Reed made, which is that GPS is, although designed originally, developed, deployed, and sustained by the DOD, that GPS is now a public utility. Its services, of course, our national security needs, as General Raymond will address, but it also services the requirements of first responders navigating to a particular address. Every time you use an ATM machine, you are using the GPS timing signal. You're not asking where the ATM is, you're using the timing signal that it is provided in order to conduct an encrypted transaction. Civil aircraft, military aircraft, commercial shipping, our deployed troops, credit card swiping machines, all of these things are in one way or another dependent upon GPS. It's forecast to be a $140+ billion industry by 2025. It's over $100 billion today in economic value. A Department of Commerce study estimated, and it's cited in my testimony, $1.4 trillion of economic benefit generated by GPS since the system was first deployed. So that's what's at risk. How is it at risk? If you go to the upper right quadrant, you can see on your chart that the fundamental aspect of the GPS infrastructure, space and ground, the entire GPS infrastructure was designed under the assumption that GPS radio navigation systems would be placed in a very quiet band of the radio spectrum, that ground-based transmitters would not be allowed in that spectrum because they drown out the very weak signals that come from satellites. At this point, with the FCC's decision, the goalposts have been moved. Now, receivers meant to detect the extremely weak signals from satellites have to cope with very loud signals in the band next door. The practical effect of this, irrespective of who pays for the changes in equipment that would have to occur, and again, I'll make Senator Reed's point for emphasis that the Ligado proposal proposes only to fix federal receivers, whereas by far the majority of use is in various aspects of the civil and commercial sector. The replacement of that equipment, regardless of who pays for it, provides a marketing niche opportunity, a refreshing of equipment that will be available to our competitors. So rather than the installed base of U.S. equipment holding sway, our competitors who have their own global navigation satellite systems will be arguing why, since the United States has damaged its own system, why shouldn't we buy from China or Russia? That's not an argument I want to have. Moreover, today, GPS is the world standard for satellite navigation. If we damage our own world standard earned through decades of investment and hard work, we should only expect that users worldwide will find other standards. That will not be to our benefit. It's very difficult to give you an accurate technical comparison of just how loud the Ligado signal is in comparison to GPS, but on the lower right, I've tried. So the decibel scale is what we use to measure loudness, if you will, whether radio noise or acoustic noise. So the quietest possible sound that can be heard might be represented by rustling leaves, which are quoted at 0 to 10 dB in the literature. On the other hand, a jet taking off will create a sound 140 to 150 decibels. If you're standing right next to it, it will blow out your eardrums. So if 0 decibels is barely audible and 140 or 50 decibels is a jet takeoff, then what we are trying to do with GPS is to hear the sound of leaves rustling through the noise of 100 jets taking off all at once. And that is a comparison which is actually favorable to Ligado. I couldn't put more than 100 jets on my chart. That's what we're trying to do here. Finally, in the lower left quadrant of the chart, moving clockwise, there are a number of myths that have been promulgated in the media about the Ligado proposal. I chose 3 of them to debunk. The first of which is the claim that Ligado, a recent claim, is critical to the build-out of U.S. 5G. In fact, my number here is not quite right. In fact, Ligado has about 3.5% of the sub-6 gigahertz spectrum in use today, if we count that portion of the spectrum allocated to the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS. 5G is about capacity, latency, and scale. The Ligado proposal has absolutely nothing to do with latency and scale, and its capacity is on the order of 3.5% of the total spectrum capacity. Ligado's existence, plus or minus, makes absolutely no difference to the involvement of U.S. in the 5G, so-called 5G race. Second, the myth is that the Department of Transportation testing, which is quoted in our, I think, all of our testimonies, myth is that that testing was flawed, that it did not assess receiver performance against a Ligado transmitter. That's true, but that's not the right test. The right test is the test to determine whether the band for satellite navigation has been protected, and the DOT testing addressed protection of the assigned GPS band in the most thorough manner I could have imagined. We'll talk more about that later, but it protects the entire band and not just one transmitter and one receiver in an artificial scenario. A third myth that has been bandied about is that Ligado stations are like a 10-watt light bulb. How can they possibly interfere with GPS? Well, in case my jet noise analogy didn't get across, let me talk to you about something for which I used to be responsible, the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope was designed to detect extraordinarily dim objects, so dim that on my decibel scale, a 10-watt bulb is 350 decibels brighter. If you shined a 10-watt bulb down the barrel of the Hubble Space Telescope, it would see nothing. It would be completely blinded. That's exactly the situation that we have with a GPS receiver trying to listen to GPS signals that are 170 decibels weaker than this 10-watt bulb. That's not a game that we can win in GPS. We will have to redesign and redeploy equipment, and the cost will be hundreds of billions of dollars and decades of deployment time. Thank you.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the committee, it's a pleasure to speak before you today on a matter of national importance, the protection of the GPS signal for use by our joint and coalition forces and the whole nation. As both the Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force and as the Commander of the United States Space Command, I have the responsibility to the Secretary of the Air Force for organizing, training, and equipping forces to provide GPS for the world, and to the Secretary of Defense for operating, integrating, and protecting GPS for our nation. I am proud to represent the airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, and space professionals who conduct these missions with such expertise. The very first GPS satellite was launched in 1978, and it was integrated into warfare for the first time in Operation Desert Storm. You all remember in 1990, early 90s, 1991, the left hook. That was enabled by a GPS constellation that wasn't even fully up and operating at the time. How do you navigate through a featureless terrain at night in the desert? You do it with GPS. Today, 25 years ago last week, it became fully operational. And today it represents the Department of Defense's largest constellation, where 31 satellites operating over 12,000 miles above the Earth's surface provide precision positioning, navigation, and timing services to 4.5 billion users and warfighters globally. And it's 3 times more accurate than it was when it was first launched in the late 70s. However, this critical capability is irrelevant if the signals coming off the satellite can't be processed by the receiver on the ground. These signals, after traveling 12,000 miles from space to reach Earth, arrive very weak. Less than a millionth of a billionth of a watt. It's hard to get your head around that small of a number. For receivers to be able to pick up such faint signals, these signals have to operate in a noise-pristine environment. And it's in that part of the spectrum. For those that ride the Amtrak train, and I had to experience this last year, it's the quiet car. It's where people don't talk. It's where emitters don't make noise because that signal is so faint. It's recognized globally as a zone reserved for satellite signals coming from space, not for emitters operating on the ground, approximately 1 billion times more powerful than the GPS signal. These ground emitters will interrupt, reduce the accuracy of, or jam the GPS signal. We must preserve this spectrum for space-to-ground signals. It's the global standard, and it puts our space capabilities, which are the gold standard, as Dr. Griffin talked about, at risk. As we compete with China and Russia, we should not cede our operational advantage. Because of the magnitude of the power overmatch between the ground antenna and the GPS signal, the mitigation steps the FCC has required will not retire all of the risk. Specifically, the 23 megahertz buffer zone will not mitigate all the risk of interference. We have a buffer zone today. It's the mobile SATCOM services band of which this ground emitter is being placed. And what this 23 megahertz buffer zone really implies, it's about half of the buffer zone that we have today. I have spent most of my military career integrating GPS and other space capabilities into everything that we do as a joint force. And today, there's absolutely nothing that we do as a joint force that isn't enabled by space and specifically GPS. In the department alone, we have over 1 million GPS receivers. They are integrated into our space launch vehicles. They're integrated into our aircraft, our tanks, on ships, on communication networks, and on our most important weapon system, our people. GPS allows us to shoot, move, and communicate with speed, precision, and over great distances. It has revolutionized military operations, and it is employed in every step of the kill chain to defeat our adversaries. Some might ask, what's the impact on the force if the emitters are only located in the continental United States? In my opinion, the impact is significant and it's unacceptable. DOD mission areas that would operate under increased risk include our most important mission, Homeland Defense. Assured GPS is critical to Homeland Defense. It could impact military and commercial launch, space launch. We use GPS to safely launch those rockets, and if they go astray, we blow those rockets up to protect public safety. We do all of our training, most of our training and building of our readiness in CONUS to be able to fight the fight overseas. And most specifically, in our defense support for civil authorities, like we are doing today with COVID, or like with wildfire suppression or hurricane relief or earthquake relief, our forces rely on GPS to accomplish that critical mission. These ground emitters could have multimodal impacts to transportation hubs, airfields, seaports, and airports. Finally, these emitters could impact overlapping defense critical infrastructure and key resource sectors like the defense industrial base, transportation, emergency services, energy, and communications. The best advice I could give is to strongly oppose the use of this spectrum that's reserved for space signals for terrestrial emitters. In doing so, if we don't, we increase the risk to our ability to conduct our critical homeland defense missions. We erode the gold standard of our space capability, ceding advantage to Russia and China. We set a dangerous precedent for repurposing this spectrum reserved for space signals. And we go against the volumes of testing that has been done, which indicate that these ground-based emitters will impact the GPS signal. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Deasy to talk about the spectrum.
So I'm going to start by saying that DOD fully supports U.S. needing to be leaders in 5G. And there's a right way we can go about it, and there is a wrong way. Ligado does not provide a 5G solution. It is not offering a solution to be a 5G leader in America. The band in which Ligado operates is not even part of the FCC 5G Fast Plan, which is the Commission's blueprint for advancing U.S. interest in 5G. The non-continuous bands that Ligado could bring to market are both fragmented and impaired. DOD clearly recognizes the huge value of 5G, not only for commercial use, but across the U.S. military as well. As you'll see up here on this chart, we're getting ready to undertake a number of experiments to learn how best to utilize this technology. If you start on the far right of this slide, I point out some of the experiments we're getting ready to work with. Augmented virtual reality, distributed training, smart warehousing and logistics, and eventually in a future phase, we'll even start looking at how to make smart ports and bases. The part of this chart I really want to draw your attention to is in the middle. We have established a dynamic spectrum sharing pilot and are examining methods to facilitate sharing between 5G and DoD airborne radars in mid-band spectrum. Let me simplify this for you. What we need to be able to do in 5G is to ensure that when civilians are using their car for 5G, or in their home, or using it in the factory, or an individual person's carrying it around, that the work we do and the operations we run in military will not interfere, and vice versa. So that's what the 5G experimentations are all about. We'll be doing these experimentations in conjunction with the National Spectrum Consortium, which is partnering with government, industry, and academia. Finally, the last most important thing is, one of the most important areas of 5G is what is called the mid-band spectrum. And what is important here for all of you to understand is how do we need to learn how to share that spectrum and make it available for both DoD use as well as commercial use. Next, in front of you, on your very last chart, you have what I like to call the key takeaways. If there's the one chart today that you should keep with you to fully appreciate what we've all shared with you. It's this chart. First of all, Mr. Chairman, as you stated, this is about risk. This is risk to the resource that America's economic engine and the vital nature of it for national security. The repurposed license is a classic case of bait and switch. FCC and Ligado want to move the goalpost by following terrestrial transmitters in a space communications ban, despite unanimous and unambiguous federal opposition. DOD and DOT both performed extensive testing and studies evaluating the potential impact to 80 military and commercial GPS receivers. Those studies concluded that Ligado's solution will cause harmful interference to both. The stringent conditions imposed by the FCC are inadequate to protect GPS, impractical, and could never be employed in real practice. The required guard band and reduced power levels do not sufficiently protect GPS receivers, as you've heard today from Dr. Griffin and General Raymond. Coordination requirements are simply impractical. There are millions of mobile GPS receivers in use, and there's no way to protect those from their mobile operations. Notification in the event of interference simply doesn't work. None of you would even know in this room today if Ligado disrupted your individual GPS device, nor would you know what to do if they did. FCC expectation for Ligado to repair or replace affected receivers is unreasonable and could never be employed in practice. The American public and military rely on GPS to support a wide range of critical applications and missions, from protecting our national security to our economic prosperity. We have always been world leaders in GPS, and we never want to see our country be forced to turn to foreign GPS providers. As General Raymond clearly articulated, the FCC decision will impact warfighter exercises, testing, training, and homeland defense. GPS must remain a reliable service and always be available when you need it most. A simple example we can all appreciate: emergency services for a 911 call. Ligado and 5G simply don't go together. They portray their solution to be 5G. This is not how the U.S. will lead in 5G. They only target a small subset of the 5G specifications. In the next several months, DOD will begin executing on important 5G experiments with government and industry. I'll close by simply saying it is clear to the DOD that the risk to GPS far outweighs the benefits of this FCC decision, and the FCC needs to reverse their decision. Thank you for your time. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deasy. We now recognize Admiral Allen for any comments.
Mr. Chairman, am I on here?
You turn your mic on, if you would, please.
Mr. Chairman? Can you hear me now?
We hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. Sorry. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today with my distinguished colleagues from the Department of Defense. My full testimony is submitted for the record. I'm testifying today in my private capacity as a citizen, and the views expressed are mine. They are not intended to represent any government agency or private firm. My testimony is based on publicly available information. My views represent my concerns and those of GPS civil users. I will try not to repeat points previously made. I've been involved in radio navigation and operations and policy for more than 50 years. 45 years ago, I was a commanding officer at Loran Station, Lampong, Thailand, as the war in Vietnam ended. 10 years ago, as the commandant of the Coast Guard, I personally turned the switch that decommissioned the final Loran Sea operating chain in the United States. My fellow panelists have presented a unified testimony regarding the impact of the FCC order and authorization to allow Ligado networks to deploy a low-power terrestrial nationwide network and the associated impacts on the Department of Defense and national security. I endorse their recommendations.
My purpose here today is to speak on behalf of the hundreds of millions of civil users of GPS. From the timing of financial transactions to power generation, synchronization of telecommunications, high-precision agriculture, intelligent transportation systems, and air navigation and airspace management, GPS has become vital to the nation's general welfare and common defense. The risk to military systems so clearly stated by this panel is also shared by civil GPS users. However, unlike our military forces who have the ability to reduce risk through encryption and other tools, civil users are a separate user segment with greater receiver diversity and fewer risk reduction options. The single point in government where the interests of the civil GPS users are integrated with the Department of Defense and brought into a consensus process is through the Position Navigation and Timing P&T Executive Committee and its supporting P&T Advisory Board. The P&T Advisory Board approach for reducing risk to the civil users has been a three-pronged strategy: protect the signal, toughen the receiver, augment GPS with backup or complementary P&T services. The impact of disruption or loss of GPS signals varies with the type of receiver. This could manifest itself in anything from an ATM malfunction to the loss of navigation in an intelligence transportation system, interference with an unmanned aerial system, or disruption of electrical power distribution. The uses of GPS range from a simple Fitbit to the provisions of course timing for highly refined parse timing services for financial transactions. While there are a host of issues raised by the FCC OA, my written testimony addresses them specifically. I wanted to hit 5 things here today. The administrative process for this decision has never been made public to gain comment on the allocation of spectrum to the ancillary terrestrial component of the service, or the Earth-based transmitters. The lack of transparent process to look at the competing criteria as how to measure disruptions in the GPS adjacent band. Third, the density of terrestrial antennas and the impact on mobile devices moving through those fields. 4, the OA shifts the performance burden to the receiver rather than protecting the spectrum, has been stated. And finally, the assertion that the Ligado plan will significantly accelerate or enhance the deployment of 5G technology. There are no 5G standards for this spectrum, as it has not been used for 5G anywhere else in the world. The concept contained in the OA that the impacts of adjacent band interference can be measured and identified by Ligado as they occur and then mitigated in a timely and effective manner without prior testing strains credibility. Tests that were utilized by the FCC were funded by Ligado, were not conducted in a transparent fashion, and not widely supported. Further, the failure of the FCC to accept the standard floor for tolerance of noise that was used by the Department of Transportation in the adjacent band compatibility study is equally quizzical, and a summary dismissal is troubling. This is a neutral guardrail for the spectrum. This approach rejects the concept of first do no harm and places it with consequence management after the event has occurred. In closing, I would like to use the words of those close to this issue in the air and on the ground. My good friend Captain Sully Sullenberger and I spoke this morning about the concerns of the aviation community. He said, putting the narrow commercial interests of one company ahead of our national security and the needs of the country is wrong-headed and dangerous. Wishful thinking and hoping that things will work out is not an effective strategy and cannot repeal the law of physics. Closer to Earth, last year during a visit to my wife's family in Illinois, I spent some time talking to corn and soybean farmers who depend on GPS services for precision navigation. I asked what happens when you lose GPS. I got a 2-word response: we quit. While you can reboot and begin planning again, if you're flying a medevac helicopter or responding to a wildfire, it's a much different problem. Spectrum is a national asset, a precious asset, and it should be protected, not subject to arbitrary and capricious decisions. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral. We're going to have a 5-minute round, and also Senator Reid and I are going to recommend a second round of questioning because there's a lot of stuff to cover here. And And I'm going to take my first 5 minutes with Director Deasy and General Raymond and Admiral Allen, and then set my other question for Dr. Griffin for the second round. Now, Director Deasy, the reason I bring this up is this is the one thing that's mentioned more than anything else when they're trying to defend what happened in the action of the FCC. So I would ask you, even though it's been touched on, can you describe the interagency process that caused the Department of Defense to conclude that Ligado's proposal was likely to interfere with GPS, and did the FCC consult you, and did they take your concerns seriously?
So, sir, the way I'd start that is when a company, in this case Ligado, wants to repurpose the spectrum, they submit that request to the FCC. The FCC, in turn, turns it over to the NTIA. Sometimes those go through what's called the Independent Radio Advisory Committee, the IRAC, which has 19 members. In the case of evaluating Ligado's request for repurposing their spectrum, it was turned over to the PNT XCOM, which is made up of 9 federal agencies. I co-chair that along with Department of Transportation. The XCOM, what they did was they, in turn, asked the Air Force to conduct a series of independent studies and testing to determine whether or not the request that Ligado had put forth was reasonable and could be accepted. The testing took place and was completed in about April of 2016. As I had mentioned in my opening remarks, what that testing did was take a number of commercial and military receivers, approximately 80, and they test them over a long, extensive period of time, and they tested them to determine the levels of noise in which they would see interference. They used the requirements of what Ligado was specifying as acceptable, and in running those tests, they clearly indicated that the results of the test caused interference in all cases. So what was done with that information? And in turn, that then is turned back over in a form of a letter that I co-signed with Department of Transportation in December of 2018. That letter clearly cited the testing that was done by the Air Force. And in that letter, we say that it was unambiguous and unanimously agreed across 9 federal agencies that this could not move forward. Given that there was still concern raised and the fact that our letter was not being acknowledged, we felt compelled to follow up with 4 additional communications. One was back in June of 2019 from then Deputy Secretary Shanahan to the FCC stating the opposition. Secretary Esper in November of 2019 forwarded a letter also stating our concerns and opposition. The IRAC sent to the NTIA on February 20th a letter from 12 agencies that were signed expressing concerns. Dr. Griffin and myself furthermore sent an additional letter to NTIA in March of 2020. And finally, Secretary Norquist sent a letter in March of 2020, of which the final letter went from NTIA to the FCC on April 2020. Each of those letters made clear and cited the testing that was done by the Air Force that this could not be accepted, nor should it be recommended to move forward, sir.
Were you, then the second part of that question was, were you consulted by the, or asked by the FCC for your opinions, and did they take them seriously?
Sir, I will tell you that historically we've had a very good working relationship with the FCC when it comes to collaboratively studying requests like this. In the case of this particular request, no, sir, there was not a give and take of back and forth that we typically go through. And at the end of the day, we were completely caught off guard when over that weekend in April, the decision was taken by the FCC to go ahead and move forward.
Thank you, Director. And then lastly, General Raymond, you did touch upon this in your opening statement. Is there anything you wanted to add in terms of the impacts on the warfighter?
Thanks. Thank you very much, sir. The way I couch GPS, it's the DNA of our way of war. It's systemic in everything that we do. And it is clear, without question, that putting a ground emitter in with the space signals will cause interruption. I think that will increase risk to force and risk to mission. And I outlined in my opening statement that mission areas of Homeland Defense, our most critical mission, defense support to civil authorities, and building the force, the training, and the readiness that we need. And I think it's a risk that we shouldn't accept.
Thank you, General. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first commend all the panelists for the very cogent and coherent and compelling testimony. Thank you all. Mr. Deasy, following on a thread that Admiral Cochran introduced, under the Administrative Procedure Act, as I understand it, a significant action by the government agency must be accompanied by a public rulemaking, which includes public comment period, response to those comments, and a publication of an order, which is then subject to judicial review. And I consider the repurposing of the satellite program, initially licensed to Light Square for satellite spectrum and then changed to a land-based system, to be a very significant public action. Was there any kind of rulemaking proceeding prior to Ligado license of only a land-based network?
No, sir. As I stated earlier, typically, as you point out something of this nature, there was a very formal process that the FCC goes through. It's a very good process, and they've used it for years. And in this particular case, we did not see that process being followed. A matter of fact, I'd go so far to say that, to the best of our knowledge, and I've talked to many people inside the DOD about this, we think this is the first time ever where the FCC has taken an arbitrary and independent decision where it was unanimously and unambiguously opposed by multiple federal agencies.
Well, thank you. And I think, as you've pointed out, the National Technical Information Administration, the NTIA, objected numerous times to the decision. 3 Secretaries of Defense, Secretary Carter, Secretary Shanahan, and Secretary Esper, have all written about their opposition of using the spectrum as the order directs. So, Mr. Deasy, you would say this is a very unusual process?
I would go as far as to say that it's an unheard of and the first precedent of its kind.
Thank you. Admiral Allen, you know the civilian sector very well. From your perspective, you would also describe this as highly unusual, or, as Mr. Deasy said, unheard of?
I would concur with his remarks. The original process should have been the allocation for the mobile satellite service spectrum. If it was reallocated to terrestrial antennas for rebroadcast, that should have been subject to a notice of proposed rulemaking and public comment.
Thank you very much. One of the concerns that I have, because the spectrum is always in play, if you will, is that this will set a very dangerous precedent, i.e., as we look at 5G in the mid-range spectrum, if the FCC operates in the same way by disregarding expertise within the federal government, we could have a situation where, instead of trying to reach a consensus, we have the FCC basically assuming and determining everything according to their own intuitions. Admiral Allen, could you give a comment on this process, this consensus process, which up until now worked but seems to be breaking down?
Well, the current relationship is based on an MOU between the FCC and NTIA. I would just offer this comment. The FCC was created. Their remit goes back to the 20s and 30s regarding radio and television spectrum. We moved into a vast new era of technology, and now there are decisions being made that impact on spectrum and space operations and so forth. Independent regulatory agencies were created to create an unbiased representation and make decisions in the public interest. The process we have right now is guided by National Security Presidential Directive 39 that requires that the equivalent of a deputy's meeting, which the XCOM is, to be subordinated to the Department of Commerce and NTIA for transmission to the FCC. And I would submit to you that process needs to be looked at.
Thank you. And just finally, General, as I understand the FCC order, Ligado must provide an 800 number to call and have a stop button once severe damages are detected. That's the remedy. So what does a warfighter in the middle of a war zone do when he discovers his system is going down? Does he get on the phone and dial 800 number and make a complaint?
Sir, the warfighter is the 800 number that the nation calls for us to do our nation's business. We don't want the warfighter to have to call an 800 number to report interference as they're doing our nation's work.
I concur entirely, but I think this might have underscored the absurdity of what we're talking about more than anything else. If this is the remedy that the FCC is proposing for interference, which would impact thousands and thousands of men and women deployed overseas, this is, we'll just stop it. It's highly unusual and probably ineffectual.
I agree, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to thank you and the ranking member for having this hearing today, and also compliment both of you on keeping this committee informed and active during the past several weeks. So thank you very much. Mr. Deasy, there's a number of mitigation proposals that are included in the FCC order, and it's my understanding that the department has expressed quite a few reservations on them. There's a process that's being, I think, contemplated where Ligado is going to work with agencies to identify potentially affected devices for upgrade, repair, or replacement. Can you walk us through some of the practical steps of how this is going to work? And I'd also ask Secretary Griffin and General Raymond to jump in on this question too. To get it started a little bit, if you could maybe address what sort of time, resources, personnel are going to be needed to carry it out. Do you see any classification restrictions or limits on proprietary data being an issue? And are GPS devices easily removed or replaced? And are these integrated systems? I'm asking you to generalize on these, but if you could maybe walk us through some of this and how you see it working or the challenges that it would face.
I'll be happy to start, and then I think Dr. Griffin is well placed to carry on this conversation. I think the easiest way to break this down is to look specifically at the order that FCC issued and quote the stringent requirements they put in place. And there's really four that I'd like to call out, and I think Senator, these touch upon what I think you're trying to get after. The first one is what they call the guard band. It says 23 megahertz. And the idea is, so Ligado has always recognized that they know that their solution does cause interference. I mean, that's something I think we can't lose in this conversation, which is why they have continued to figure out how to lower their power and why they've created what's called this guard band. They state because they're 23 megahertz away, that in itself clearly should be sufficient to allow them to operate. I think Dr. Griffin gave some compelling testimony today that clearly showed that simply won't work and the noise that will be created. The second thing they talk about is the lowering the power. Now, if you go back to the original Light Square, to the early days of Ligado, they've continued to lower the power, and they're doing that because they know that their solution will cause interference to GPS. They try to make this, quote, 10-watt light bulb sound so insignificant, but I think Dr. Griffin's comment about the Hubble telescope was really quite compelling. So it's unrealistic to think that they're ever going to get to a power level that would make ground-based terrestrial communications acceptable. Then they talk about coordination. Now, what they're really saying there is that as they stand up their terrestrial-based solution, they're going to, quote, coordinate. And that if we say there's a problem, they will address it. Well, this is how you tell if there's a problem. They install a terrestrial ground-based solution, they turn it on, and then we have to report back to them what that interference is, where that interference is causing problems. And think about the civil side of that. How will that coordination actually take place? On the military side, we will have a difficult enough time given the millions and millions of GPS receivers. And to your point, when you start to talk about embedded receivers in assets that we have inside the military, it's not like you can pull that asset out and simply install a new one that won't cause interference. This will cost, I can't tell you specifically, ma'am, what the dollars or the people requirements would be, because we'd have to look at that on an asset-by-asset basis. And then finally, remediation. Simply put, if you read the order carefully, the burden is actually on the Department of Defense. We have to call out what the problem is, and then, quote, once we clearly identify the problems, they'll remediate. Well, remember, many of our assets are highly classified. And so the very point of being able to go in and articulate what those problems are and how they should go about remediating them is simply not practical.
Mr. Secretary, do you or the General have anything to add?
I'll be brief. What's not being addressed when one talks about repair and replace, even among the federal receivers, which Ligado promises to replace, is the expense and the downtime of doing so. Let me give you a comparison. Aviation-grade receivers are designed because of the cruciality of those, and Senator Inhofe, like you, I'm a pilot. The aviation-grade receivers in my airplane cost $10,000 or so a piece. They're much more cumbersome, they're larger, they consume more power in order to produce a hardened design to just this type of interference. The GPS receivers that go on someone's tractor or first response vehicle or in the automotive navigation system in your car or in a routine piece of military hardware are not hardened like that. And the expense of introducing new designs to make them so is not even being discussed. It should be.
And also, we're talking about disruption, but we're also talking about national security, which is a definite threat that there isn't time to address. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and Senator Reid for holding this timely hearing. And I appreciate the testimony of all of our experts today. I guess this question is for you, Mr. Deasy. Was DOD surprised by the FCC decision?
The simple answer is yes. We have been in communications with FCC back and forth over this matter for some time, including the NTIA. And we, you know, along this whole journey, if you kind of go through that timeline I gave earlier, we're clearly of the belief that they understood, they had received our letters, they had received the NTIA letters, and clearly knew that there was a unanimous view across federal agencies not to move forward. So I have to admit, when I first read and heard about this, I was very surprised. And as I talked to other senior leaders across the DOD, likewise, they have been just as surprised.
So reports had suggested that the FCC was actually moving in a different direction, that they were going to deny Ligado's request. Was that your expectation before the turnaround?
Yes, the head of C3 inside of my organization, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Fred Moorfield, has been in constant communications over a number of months, actually years on this, with both the NTIA and FCC. One of his responsibilities was to give me weekly updates as to how the conversations were progressing with FCC and NTIA. And every time we had the conversation, it was all FCC and NTIA clearly understand our position. And at no time did he suggest that he had an indication or belief that it was going to move forward.
And the decision, as you've described and as I've read, was made very unexpectedly, very hurriedly, without the kind of process that Senator Reid raised that is usually expected. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So what do you think the motivation of the FCC is in making this decision? You must have some speculation about that.
Actually, I don't. I would not have been surprised if I had felt I clearly understood what the motivations were, because I frankly did not see this coming.
Admiral, do you have any thoughts about why the FCC would have made this decision so unexpectedly?
It's quizzical. If you look at the order that was issued, it's, I think it's 74 pages long. You don't write that overnight. That had to be in preparation for quite a while. The footnotes are extensive. You can agree or not agree with the report. What astounded me was that had to be in the works for quite a while, and it happened suddenly. And in my view, that was a breakdown of communications and building a consensus around proper rulemaking with an independent regulatory agency.
So how does a decision like this happen when you've got virtually every other federal agency that is concerned about this issue saying this is the wrong direction to take? How then does one agency, and I appreciate it, it bills itself as independent, and there are certain agencies that we want to view as independent within government, but one would also hope that we're all trying to move in the same direction as part of government. So can anybody speculate on how this happened and why this agency would have taken this position, given that, according to all of the research you all cited, that they aren't a significant part of an effort in this country to move to 5G? Nobody has any ideas?
It would appear to be a good topic for the committee of original jurisdiction.
I would certainly agree with that. So the next question is then, what would you like to see happen? What would you like to see this committee do, and what would you like to see Congress do to address this decision, which seems clearly against the interests not just of the Department of Defense, but of all of the commercial interests that are involved here?
Now, I'll start by simply saying it's on my key takeaway chart. It's the last bullet that said that FCC needs to reverse their decision. So
but how has that happened before, and how realistic do you think that is, that the FCC on their own motivation will reverse their decision?
There is a petition that NTIA can file requesting that the FCC go back, revisit that decision. We would need to obviously present for the NTIA the necessary information for that petition to be filed, but there is a process that one can go through for them to reconsider their decision, and I believe we do need to go through that process.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Reid. I look forward to joining you on your letter.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also add my thanks to you and the ranking member for organizing and allowing us to stay informed during the time in which we were in our work periods at home. And thank you also for organizing this full committee discussion on the issue of spectrum, and in particular, the issue in front of us today concerning the Ligado application. Mr. Deasy, I'd like to spend my time with you today focusing on the other spectrum issues that we've got. Last year, in the National Defense Authorization Act, this committee had proposed a Section 214, which has become popular all by itself in terms of the fact that it was not operational by the time we got done. And it had to do with allowing for spectrum sharing. And we recognize that DOD has a critical need for spectrum, and that only on an organized effort can we allow for sharing of that mid-level of the spectrum. This brings to light an area in the lower spectrum, but most certainly the rest of the spectrum is also at risk as well. We had proposed creating a tool last year, and we did not realize the type of opposition we would find, creating a tool so that we could fairly share spectrum, which was critical in our national defense. Can you discuss a little bit with the committee the need for a tool that would allow us to appropriately share and at the same time safeguard extremely critical portions in geographic locations as well, but basically an opportunity to share what is a very, very valuable resource, and that is that mid-level spectrum?
So I would start, I'll be happy to comment on Section 214, and then possibly Dr. Griffin to talk about what it is we are doing as far as moving forward with 5G from experimentations. You know, you bring a very good point on Section 214. We go back, the Communications Act was passed back in 1934. There's been all kinds of addendums to that act. And yet, throughout this, if you look at the policies, the processes, the tools that have been used, where we go through in government to look at repurposing spectrum, they're antiquated. One of the reasons I was so excited about 214 was the opportunity for these processes, these procedures, and the tools to be updated. We need these tools because not only does it help us to look at how do you repurpose spectrum, but allows us to manage and incorporate how you actually have to operate the spectrum. For us to get to faster spectrum repurposing decisions, and the key word there is faster, we cannot do that without moving towards dynamic spectrum sharing. To do that, 214 provided us the opportunity to modernize the tools, to modernize the processes on how we go about doing this, sir.
In terms of national defense, would you say that this particular discussion concerning the Ligado application is perhaps just a shot over the bow as to how serious these issues are and the need to revisit what we were trying to do in 214 last year?
I would say when it comes to the discussion of national defense, I would defer to General Raymond to discuss the views on that.
General Raymond?
I am not an expert at 214, but I'll tell you the use of spectrum is critical to our force. It's our maneuver space. It provides a strategic, operational, and tactical advantage. When you look at what kind of capabilities we have to be able to operate in that spectrum. We have to be able to detect, characterize, and geolocate interference. We have to be able to operate in that spectrum. We train to do so every day, and it's absolutely critical to our joint force.
Thank you. General, one more question. With regard to the amount of data that we're collecting right now with the platforms that we already have within our system today, we're collecting huge amounts of data, and the need for 5G is critical. Would it be fair to say that the Department of Defense is looking at 5G as a way to collect and to make our platforms even more capable than what they are today, and that the Department of Defense is very interested in the deployment of 5G and not trying to stop it, but rather it is necessary and it just simply has to be done correctly?
I agree wholeheartedly. I go to work every day, and the folks that I'm privileged to lead go to work every day trying to implement the national defense strategy that says we're going to compete, deter, and win. That's what we do, and 5G is going to be critical to us. But I will also tell you, GPS is also critical to us in being able to compete, deter, and win.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Hirono.
Sorry. Whatever. I think you can hear me. I'd like to ask a very brief, non-Ligado question because we do have the DOD's Chief of Information Office here. So DOD has seen a significant spike in cyber attacks and misinformation directed at service members and personnel as the Pentagon shifts toward telework during this pandemic. Mr. Deasy, what additional measures are being instituted in the department to combat the increased phishing and hacking that has occurred during this current COVID-19 pandemic?
So a couple things on that. You know, we actually measure how often our network is probed, how many spams we get, how many types of interference we get on our network. We've clearly seen an uptick. One of the upticks we've seen most is spear phishing.
Yeah.
And that is specific COVID-related emails that are coming in where the adversary is trying to take the opportunity to use COVID as the topic to get people to actively engage on. However, with that said, when we look at other types of activities that U.S. Cyber Command sees, I have a task force where we meet every week, and in that task force we discuss the very things that you're bringing up. We are not seeing an abnormal amount of other types of activities that our metrics would suggest go above and beyond what we normally see, other than specifically in the spear phishing area, we are seeing an uptick specifically related to COVID. So what have we been doing? Because now we have moved to teleworking and we are using technology known as VPN and other types of tools that allow people to communicate from home, I'd say a couple things have been really important here. Within the first week after we started moving to teleworking, my office issued a letter, a memo that went out to all employees. It included a small card, I don't have it with me here today, that actually clearly listed the do's and don'ts of what you should do from your home when you're teleworking, and what were the additional things to be thoughtful and mindful of now that you were working from home. Additionally, U.S. Cyber Command did stand up additional task force teams to specifically look at the network and traffic activity that was occurring because of teleworking, ma'am.
So have you been able to identify whether the spear phishing and some of these other cyber attacks are emanating from any particular country?
All I would say is to get into specifics of where those attacks are coming from and what the motivations are probably go beyond the classification.
That's right, I understand.
Of this discussion today.
So let's move on to some of the questions that are relevant to this hearing. The National Advanced Spectrum and Communications Test Network, NASCTN, a multi-agency charter partnership that seeks to provide a neutral forum for testing, modeling, and analysis, performed a study to determine the impact of Ligado's proposed networks on GPS. The FCC relied on the results of this study in approving Ligado's application. I understand that your DOD takes issue with the NASCTN study. As an initial matter, Ligado claimed in a filing made with the FCC that the tests it commissioned at the NASCTN were done at the request of the DOD Chief Information Officer's office. Is that true?
There was a test and a request made from my predecessor that asked to look at what Ligado was proposing at the time. At the time, that testing was based on the assumption that Ligado was still going to use satellite-based communications towards the Earth, and only on exception would they use terrestrial-based. So when we agreed to that, it was agreed on the premise that their solution was still going to be primary a satellite-based solution and not a terrestrial ground-based solution. Afterwards, expression we've used today is they changed the goalpost. They said they now wanted to go to a terrestrial-based. So basically, the rules changed in the process of how that test was originally conducted to what Ligado wanted to do going forward, ma'am.
So in your view, with the goalposts being changed, that the tests that NASCTN did were really not on point to the giving of the license?
I guess you would say they were on point for what was assumed at the time, but where we are today was no longer on point.
So you say that the FCC needs to reverse its decision, and there is a process for asking for reconsideration or reversal. Has that process begun?
So what we've done from the DOD standpoint is we've had communications on a regular basis with the NTIA. I'm actively getting engaged with the NTIA, making a formal request for them to do a file for repetition.
What is the time frame for reconsideration or reversal by FCC?
I would have to get back to you with the specific dates. I don't know what those dates are. I'm not sure if my...
Anyway, you're not going to let that time expire before
Absolutely
you take
not.
action?
I believe it's somewhere towards the end of May that we have to have communicated that repetition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Kramer.
Thank you. that on? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Reid as well. Just echo everyone's sentiment about what a great job you've done keeping us engaged and involved and communicating so thoroughly. And thanks to each of you. I'm sitting here a little bit, well, I'm curious. It's a good place to sit when you're curious, when you have four really smart people to ask questions of. But some of the questions I have, you're gonna have to speculate about, because I want to ask you about what people that won't support this, why they would have supported it, and that may seem a little bit unfair, but you're all I have. One thing I want to get straightened out, because I've heard it said that the NTIA objected, but I've also read that the NTIA did not recommend or could not recommend. Is there a distinction there between not recommending and objecting, given the NTIA's authorities? And I don't know which one of you, maybe Mr. Deasy, you'd know the answer to that. I mean, I used to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. I was a communications telecoms regulator for 10 years. So I think there's a distinction there. I just want to be sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could legally tell you what those distinctions are, but I will say that clearly what NTIA's role is to represent back the agency's view on this. So in this case, you have a position, navigation, timing, XCOM, which is made up of 9 federal agencies. Their job was to take our view, put that in a formal letter, and then submit that view back to the FCC. So I can tell you that their job in that case was to submit the view of the PNT.
Does the NTIA ever recommend a yay or a nay to the FCC?
I'll have to ask other colleagues if they know.
All right. We'll find that out. I'm curious about it, because it does seem to me here that process matters. You're all too smart for me to ask technical questions of, so I'm going to focus on process a little bit. Because the other thing that sort of perplexes me a little bit is that, first of all, somehow 5 commissioners came to some version of the same conclusion. That's another thing, that just because they either voted yes or didn't object doesn't necessarily mean they have the same degree of enthusiasm for a decision. But nonetheless, it was 5-0. And my reading tells me NTIA did not object, nor did they recommend. I think they can recommend. But there are some other fairly important administration folks that are concerned about national security that seem to have supported the decision unless they've changed their minds. And that would be, of course, Secretary of State Pompeo and Attorney General Barr. Does anybody know if they've changed their minds or why they feel differently? Yeah. Okay, I'll ask them, I guess. That'd be the best thing to do. The one other process question I have is, how long was this application in? Does anybody know when the application was made?
Know the date, Mike?
Because my sense is that there's volumes and volumes and volumes and hours and hours and hours dedicated to this, and we know about yours, obviously, and I would just be interested kind of in some more of the story. It just helps me to satisfy my curiosity. I have no doubt that everything you've said is absolutely 100% accurate and true. Don't get me wrong. But it does help me balance my thinking when I hear a little more from someone else. But I know that's not your objective, but it's just kind of mine. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll ask some questions other places. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, it's really important information. And what's really important is other people hear it.
Let me shed a little light on that. They took over that bankrupt company in the year 2015. And I have reason for, having looked at this quite a bit, to believe that they had been working on their licensing for quite some time. And while they've been looking at it, none of us that I know of were aware that that was going on. So I just think there's a level of security that they had among themselves. I'm saying that as nice as I can.
No, I understand, and I'm sure you're right.
Yes, thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Kane. Senator Kane.
Mr. Chair, and again, I echo my comments that I said to you personally yesterday. This was the only committee that I serve on 4, that had weekly telephone conferences during the time we were away, and they were really valuable. And we had some spirited debate, and sometimes I got an answer to a question I liked, and sometimes I didn't. But this was the only committee that was doing that every week, and I really applaud the leadership, the chair and ranking for that. You've made some really persuasive points, but you haven't persuaded me. And the reason you haven't is we've only heard one side of the case. I tried a lot of cases in my day before I got into this line of work, and I would never make a decision and agree, yeah, the FCC needs to reverse their decision when the FCC's right in town and could have been at this hearing. Or Ligado. If Ligado knew that we were concerned, they'd want to come and make their case. All of the questions and concerns and the speculation is completely unnecessary. There are two sides to this. The FCC reached a unanimous decision, which is not that common for that body on matters of controversy. And they would have something to say about all these questions. And because of your testimony, which has been great testimony, I would have really tough questions for them. But it's hard to convince an Armed Services Committee member to reverse a decision based upon the presentation of one side of the case. Let me ask you a couple of questions. My understanding from the timeline is that the XCOM, is it the PNT XCOM, looked at testing that had been done beginning in 2016 and made a recommendation in March of 2018 to oppose the Ligado proposal. Is that basically right, that the PNT XCOM unanimous decision to oppose the proposal was made in March of 2018?
Sir, I am personally not familiar with that particular date. I'm familiar with the date of December of 2018 in which we formally documented to NTIA the view of PNT.
I am reading from materials that have been provided by the DOD, but it looks like testing was earlier. The PNT XCOM reached a unanimous decision in March, and then it was communicated, Mr. Deasy, as you say, in December. Was the information, the proposal as tested and as opposed in March of 2018 and then communicated in December of 2018, was that exactly the same proposal that the FCC ruled upon on April 20th?
Throughout this process, there have been multiple amendments to what Ligado's had to propose. And so,
and you mentioned a couple. You mentioned the idea of the buffer that they created and that lowering power. So my surmise is that the objection that was done in 2018 was based upon a version of the Ligado proposal, but the FCC approval in April of 2020 was based upon a proposal that had changed in some ways. Is that correct?
Well, the proposal, as far as I know, and Dr. Griffin, maybe you can speak to specific testing was done, was the proposal in 2020 that was just recently approved with those restrictions. When we go back and look at what was done on the testing against those restrictions, nothing has changed.
Well, but that's not my question. So my question is a real precise one, which is the proposal that the FCC ruled on the same proposal that the PNT Execcom unanimously decided to disapprove in March of 2018, or were there changes? You were suggesting to me that there were changes along the way.
There has been changes along the way of which we have continued to communicate and evaluate those. The letter of 2018, I'd have to go back.
Okay, let me ask this. The April 2020 ruling of the FCC had some conditions in it. Now, that was 16 days ago that they reached that conclusion. Have you, with the significant testing capacity at your disposal, have you gone back and rerun tests against the version of the FCC that the FCC approved with the requirements, the quote stringent requirements they put on it? So have you done any more testing since April 20th?
I'm not aware of any specific tests that have been done. And I think the reason is those particular guard bands, power levels, coordination, and remediations were all the same that we had looked at previously.
Okay, I'll want to get that in writing, because I want to make sure that the opposition in March of 2018 in fact applied to the proposal as it existed and was approved in April 2020. Senator Kramer indicated that he thinks the Attorney General and Secretary of State are now in support of the Ligado proposal for the FCC. Is that correct?
That's what I have heard in the public.
Have you then sought to find out why that would be the case?
I have not personally, no, sir.
Are either of those members of this 9-member NT Execcom or state and DOJ, or are they not members of that 9-member task force?
They are. The Department of State is a member of that.
And how about the Department of Justice?
The Department of Justice is not a member of that.
All right, I've exceeded my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Reid, I want to add my voice to what Senator Kane said. Thank you for your commitment during our long break from Washington during this pandemic, for holding regular weekly conference calls, and thank you for putting together this very important hearing. I'll associate myself with Senator Kane's remarks again, a second time, and that I think you make a pretty compelling case. I've read through all these materials that we've had for the hearing, but it's really important that we hear from the unanimous FCC and from Ligado as well for us to make a reasoned conclusion. I'll associate myself with Senator Kane for a third time. He's probably beginning to get anxious about this, about the Attorney General and the Secretary of State. Senator Kramer's asked this. Senator Kane's asked this. Let me just ask Mr. Deasy and Dr. Griffin directly. What do you see that Attorney General Barr and Secretary Pompeo don't see? You oppose this proposal. They support the proposal. So what is it that you see that they don't see?
Sir, I've, as a technologist for almost 40 years now, I see the science, I see the studies, I see the results of what has been done.
Could well be right.
And the science clearly shows everything we've talked about today in terms of the interference. So that's what I see. I can't speculate on what Secretary Pompeo or Secretary Barr are seeing.
So Senator Kane raised this as well about the testing. I mean, has there been specific, realistic testing done under the conditions proposed by the FCC in last month's order? I've read a lot of the materials here. I've got Secretary Esper's letter here, and there's a lot of conditional verbs in that letter. There's a lot of conditional verbs in the other material I've read here. Things like may jeopardize the effectiveness and reliability of GPS. It has the potential to disrupt commercial GPS receivers. Has there been testing on specific realistic conditions of the FCC's order that we can say, yes, it will interfere?
There hasn't been any testing since the order was issued 16 days ago. The testing that was done not by the Department of Defense, but by the Department of Transportation, and it is as exquisitely well done as anything that I think I have ever seen. They tested 80 receivers. They tested them against the power levels that Ligado is claiming today to use, and in answer to Senator Kane's question, the power level is the most significant single attribute against which one would test. The DOT tests, as I said in my earlier testimony, were designed to elucidate what was necessary to protect the GPS band. The issue of testing one transmitter against one receiver and substituting one receiver after another in specific scenarios is, frankly, a fool's errand. I can always put together a different geometry, a different scenario, and then ask the question again, would Ligado interfere with that? That is not the way to go about it. The way that the Department of Transportation did in its adjacent band compatibility test is the way to go about it. Those results were unambiguous. They were compelling. At the power levels that Ligado chooses to put forward for its ground-based transmissions, GPS receivers, broadly speaking, will be compromised.
Okay, I have one final set of questions here, and Dr. Griffin, I'll direct these towards you. They're on a related matter. In January, numerous media outlets, to include the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, reported that the Pentagon was going to block a set of rules that would have limited the export of semiconductors, computer chips, and other kinds of advanced microelectronics to Huawei. Is it correct that the Department of Defense initially non-concurred, to use the technical term, with these rule changes?
I don't know if the Department of Defense non-concurred. The Research and Engineering Undersecretary at my organization non-concurred. We don't believe that those particular restrictions were going to be beneficial, and that we believe that they would hurt the U.S. semiconductor industry more than they would hurt China. If the goal is to damage China, that's not the tool to use.
But Secretary Esper did not agree with that.
That's correct.
So this is just another concern that I have, is that the Department of Defense could have an exaggerated sense of scientific and technological certitude that is not appropriately balancing the strategic imperatives or the geopolitical challenges we face. I'm not saying that is the case, but in light of that decision, and in light of the case I see here in front of me, much of which is contingent, I think we at least need to continue to explore that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks for the work during the break and the time that we had talking about the coronavirus response at the department. What was the power level that was used for the DOT testing, please?
DOT provided results for the original Ligado power level, I believe, of 1,500 watts, and specifically to the present case and the present FCC order, 10 watts.
Can you put that in terms of dBW?
dBW would be 10 dBW for the 10-watt transmitter.
So transportation, so the study did include the 9.8 dBW analysis?
Correct.
And that did find clear evidence of interference?
Exactly so, sir.
And
in fact, they published carefully the power levels required to cause the suite of receivers that were tested to lock up.
Good.
Could you supply that data to this committee, please?
Absolutely.
I'd appreciate that. I share some of the concerns that have been raised. The FCC they're capable people. I don't always agree with them. It's one of the few unanimous orders I've seen them undertake. It's a 74-page order with 444 footnotes. It strikes me that some serious thought went into it. And they have two concerns, as I understand the order. One is the development of the Internet of Things, and that's an important part of the future development of 5G technology and indeed the technology of the country. The second is efficient use of spectrum. What is the shadow cast by the GPS band? In other words, how much spectrum are you
questioning your version of what happened here?
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking that it sounds like a court challenge waiting to happen, and I guess it's on us to try to ask some of these questions of the private parties, and that was the reason for my question.
That's very fair, very fair. All right, anything else for you? Nothing else, we're adjourned. Let me, I wanted to go ahead and get adjourned before somebody else came in, but let me just say to you folks, and make sure that I ask unanimous consent to be on the record, I thank you very much, all four of you. You offered an expertise, a level of expertise that I don't think many of us really understand. I know I don't, but I do know that when you get so many people in opposition to something, with the veracity of that opposition, it's something that does concern me. There's nothing more important going on than a threat to this country. And, you know, I've got 20 kids and grandkids that are going to be here a lot longer than I am that are equally concerned. So thank you so much for the time that you've taken, and we thank you for being here.